If I put an amateur chess player and a seasoned grandmaster into a functional MRI scanner, and I have them both play this incredibly complex, high-stakes match, you'd probably make a very logical assumption about what their brains would look like.
Right, you'd assume the Grandmaster's brain is just lighting up like a supercomputer.
Exactly. You'd expect to see this massive, blinding wave of metabolic activity, just burning through glucose, firing on all cylinders to calculate 50 moves ahead. But you'd be entirely wrong.
Completely wrong, yeah.
If you look at the scans side by side, the Grandmaster's brain is actually almost entirely dark.
It's the ultimate paradox of human performance.
Yeah.
We have this culturally ingrained idea that trying harder and, being better at something requires more physical and mental energy.
Right, like no pain, no gain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the neuroimaging data shows us the exact opposite. Mastery is not about working harder. Mastery is about achieving a state of profound, localized silence in the brain.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission for this conversation is to really pull back the curtain on the literal physical differences between the amateur brain and the expert brain.
Yeah, we are not just talking about psychology or mindset here.
No, not at all. We are asking what actually changes in your neuroanatomy, your cellular structure, and, your regional brain activity when you take a complex skill and you utterly master it.
We're in a golden age for answering that question. We don't have to guess anymore.
Thankfully.
Yeah, the imaging tools we have today, functional MRI, near-infrared spectroscopy, Voxel-Based morphometry, they allow us to literally watch the hardware of the human brain physically rewire itself in response to training.
And we have a massive stack of sources to guide us through this today. We're pulling from this mountain of neuroimaging studies, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses published over the last 2 decades.
It's a lot of data.
A ton. We are going to look at the brains of professional violinists, elite athletes, simultaneous interpreters at the UN, laparoscopic surgeons, and of course, those chess grandmasters.
What I find most compelling about this specific stack of research is the cross-disciplinary consensus. We aren't just looking at one niche hobby.
Right.
Whether you are manipulating a scalpel inside a human abdomen or you are moving a wooden knight across a checkered board, the biological signature of expertise follows this remarkably universal trajectory.
It's wild, but to truly appreciate the quiet, elegant efficiency of the expert brain, we kind of have to start at the opposite end of the spectrum. We have to look at the noisy, energy-draining, chaotic mess that is the amateur brain.
Which means we need to talk about the frontal lobes, specifically the prefrontal cortex or the PFC.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you are listening to this and you've ever tried to learn a new, highly complex skill, you are intimately familiar with the prefrontal cortex, even if you didn't know its name. Geographically, it's the large region of the brain sitting right behind your forehead, and functionally, you can think of the PFC as the brain's chief executive officer.
The CEO analogy is very apt, actually.
Mm.
The prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function. It handles cognitive control, working memory, rule maintenance, all of that.
Right.
When you're a complete novice at a task, you have no existing neural architecture to rely on. So the CEO has to step in and basically micromanage every single detail.
Let's visualize that. Think about the very first time you learned to drive a manual transmission car.
Oh man, stressful.
So stressful. You sit in the driver's seat and the cognitive load is absolutely crushing. You are consciously, actively narrating every single movement to yourself.
Yeah, your PFC is screaming, okay, left foot pressing the clutch all the way to the floor, right hand moving the stick into first gear.
Slowly ease off the clutch while gently pressing the gas pedal. Oh wait, check the rear view mirror. Keep the steering wheel straight. Turn the radio off because I literally cannot hear myself think.
And, the reason you have to turn the radio off is because the prefrontal cortex has a very strict bandwidth limit. It can only hold a few pieces of information in its working memory at any given time.
Which is why it feels so overwhelming.
Exactly. When you are an amateur, the sheer mechanics of the task consume 100% of that bandwidth. The metabolic demand on the tissue behind your forehead is immense because your neurons are firing frantically just to maintain all those conscious rules.
And we have some incredible concrete data illustrating this exact phenomenon in a much higher stakes environment than, a high school parking lot. Let's look at the medical world.
Yes, surgery.
Right, surgery. We have a comprehensive 2022 systematic review by Hannah and colleagues titled Neuromonitoring Correlates of Expertise Level in Surgical Performers, a systematic review. This was published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience.
Surgery is arguably the perfect laboratory for studying expertise acquisition. I mean, the motor skills required are incredibly fine-tuned.
The spatial reasoning is highly complex.
And the consequences for error are immediate and severe.
So this review brings together several landmark experiments. Let's start with the work by Leff and his team, conducted across 2007 and 2008. They basically wanted to see what happens in the brain when someone ties a surgical knot.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Definitely. So they recruited 62 participants. They had a mix of highly experienced attending surgeons, intermediate surgical residents, and brand new medical students. They hooked them up to brain scanners and told them to tie knots.
And the resulting neuroimaging data was a perfect visual representation of your manual car analogy. The medical students, the pure amateurs, showed massive widespread activation localized heavily in the left prefrontal cortex.
So the CEO is panicking.
Oh, completely. The metabolic demand in that region was just off the charts. They were thinking their way through the knot, trying to consciously force their fingers to execute a spatial pattern they simply hadn't internalized yet.
But the attending surgeons, the people who have tied tens of thousands of these knots in the operating room over their careers, they showed almost no activation in the prefrontal cortex. The CEO was completely silent.
What's fascinating here is the specific threshold of expertise they identified in that study. When they looked at the intermediate group, the surgical residents who were just halfway through their training,
Right.
the prefrontal activation was already indistinguishable from the attending surgeons.
Wait, really? So a resident with maybe 3 years of experience has the same brain activation as an attending with 20 years?
In the prefrontal cortex, yes.
Yeah.
Both the residents and the attendings vastly outperformed the medical students in terms of speed and accuracy, and both had quiet PFCs.
That's amazing.
It tells us a fundamental truth about skill acquisition. The prefrontal cortex doesn't gradually taper off over decades. Once a certain baseline level of motor proficiency is reached and the sequence is memorized, the CEO steps back abruptly. It delegates the task.
I want to get even more granular with how we measure this because the technology itself is fascinating. In that same 2022 HANA review, they detail a 2021 experiment by a researcher named Kills and his team.
Right, the peg transfer.
Yeah. This wasn't just tying a string. This was a laparoscopic peg transfer and threading task.
Which is notoriously difficult.
Yeah.
Laparoscopy involves looking at a 2D monitor while using long, awkward instruments inserted through small incisions to manipulate tiny objects in a 3D space.
It's like playing a video game with chopsticks.
Basically, you have a fulcrum effect, where moving your hand left makes the instrument go right inside the cavity. It completely breaks your natural spatial intuition.
Exactly. So to measure brain activity during this incredibly frustrating task, Keels used functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or fNIRS.
A really cool tool.
It is. For anyone unfamiliar, this involves placing sensors on the forehead that literally shine near-infrared light through the skull and into the brain tissue.
It's a brilliant technology because oxygenated hemoglobin and deoxygenated hemoglobin absorb that light differently.
Right.
By measuring the light that bounces back out, researchers can calculate exactly how much oxygen the prefrontal cortex is demanding in real time. It's a direct proxy for how hard the brain is working.
So they take this fNIRS data from the PEG transfer task, and they do something really clever. They don't just look at it with the naked eye. They feed the raw blood flow data into machine learning algorithms.
To see if a computer model could figure out who was the expert and who was the amateur.
Yes, without ever seeing their hands or their surgical performance.
And the algorithm achieved an impressive 70 to 80% classification accuracy. Just by analyzing the metabolic oxygen demand in the front of the brain, the computer could reliably separate the fumbling medical students from the seasoned attending surgeons.
That's crazy.
The biological signature of amateurism, is that pronounced?
But here's the kicker for me. This is the study that completely shifted my understanding of what learning actually is. The HANA review highlights a 2016 study by Shetty and colleagues. They looked at a laparoscopic suturing task.
Oh.
Initially, as expected, the novices had 4 to 5 times greater prefrontal cortex activation than the experts. So the researchers put those novices through a grueling 2-week intensive training boot camp.
They essentially forced them to practice until their hands were blistered.
Right, just nonstop repetition. And it worked. After 2 weeks, the novices were tested again, and they actually matched the experts in all the behavioral performance metrics.
Wow.
Yeah. They were completing the sutures just as fast and with the exact same level of physical accuracy as the veteran surgeons. If you were just watching their hands, you honestly wouldn't be able to tell who was who.
But then they looked at the fNIRS data.
Yes. When they looked at the brain activity, that massive disparity in PFC activation was still there.
Incredible.
The novices were still using 4 to 5 times more of their prefrontal cortex to achieve the exact same behavioral result as the experts.
I love this finding because it exposes the illusion of behavioral performance. We often assume that if someone can perform a task perfectly, they have mastered it.
But they haven't.
Exactly. This study proves that motor skill consolidation, the actual hardwiring of the brain, was still silently ongoing in the background for those novices. They hadn't mastered the skill. They were merely masking their amateur neural architecture with sheer brute force cognitive effort.
They were white-knuckling their way to a perfect score.
Precisely. And that is incredibly dangerous in a real-world setting. If you connect this to the bigger picture, it explains a well-documented phenomenon known as the expertise reversal effect, which deals with cognitive load.
Let me stop you there. What exactly is the expertise reversal effect?
Think about what happens when you introduce a distraction. If you take those novices who just completed their 2-week boot camp, and while they're suturing perfectly, you suddenly ask them to count backwards from 100 by 7s.
Oh, their suturing performance would completely collapse.
Instantly. Because their prefrontal cortex is already operating at 100% capacity just to manage the suturing. The moment you introduce a secondary cognitive demand, the system crashes.
That makes sense.
In novices, as the environment gets more complex, PFC activation spikes until it fails. But in true experts, their PFC isn't involved in the suturing at all. So you can ask the expert surgeon to count backwards from 100 by 7s, and their suturing won't slow down by a single millisecond.
That makes perfect sense. True automaticity means you have the ability to perform a complex task with zero interference from a demanding secondary task. The CEO isn't driving the car anymore.
Exactly.
But that leads to the most obvious follow-up question. If the prefrontal cortex is stepping down and relinquishing control, who exactly is driving the car? Where in the brain is this highly complex automated surgical knot actually living?
It moves out of the conscious cortex entirely. The power is handed off to the brain's middle management system specifically, a collection of deep subcortical structures called the basal ganglia and the brain's quality control center, the cerebellum.
Section 2 of our deep dive into the expert brain, the middleman. This is where the actual magic of habit formation and skill consolidation happens.
It was the engine room.
Right, and because these structures operate beneath our conscious awareness, it explains why true experts often can't tell you how they do what they do. If you ask a legendary golfer exactly how they shift their weight during a swing, they often give terrible advice.
Yeah, because they haven't consciously thought about it in a decade. They are completely disconnected from the mechanics of their own bodies.
Let's start with the basal ganglia, or the BG. For you listening and trying to visualize this, the basal ganglia is a cluster of neurons situated deep inside the cerebrum, right near the base of the brain. It's an evolutionarily ancient structure.
Very ancient.
We have a brilliant paper from our sources that models exactly how this works. It's a 2010 paper by Stocco, Lebiere, and Anderson, published in the Psychological Review, titled Conditional Routing of Information to the Cortex, a model of the basal ganglia's role in cognitive coordination.
This is a heavy, computationally dense paper, but the core concept is really elegant. They propose a routing model based on what's called the ACTR cognitive architecture.
And the best way to understand this routing model is to imagine the basal ganglia as a highly sophisticated, hyper-fast telephone switchboard operator from the 1950s.
The switchboard analogy is scientifically very sound. The outer layer of your brain, the cortex, is constantly generating millions of possible actions, sensory representations, and motor plans.
It's just nonstop noise.
Yeah. If all of those fired at once, you would be paralyzed by chaotic random movement.
So the basal ganglia's default state is actually inhibition. It's holding everything back.
Exactly. It applies a constant, heavy blanket of inhibition over the motor cortex. It essentially says, no one moves until I say so.
I love that.
The switchboard operator's job is to recognize a specific context or goal, temporarily lift the inhibition on one specific neural pathway, and route that specific signal through to the motor cortex for execution. We call this disinhibition.
It's selecting the one correct action out of 1,000 wrong ones and plugging the cable into the right socket. But how does the switchboard actually learn to route this information automatically? How does it take a clumsy novice action and turn it into an expert reflex?
The sources describe a distinct two-step learning phase. Step 1 happens when you are a novice. Let's say you are learning to play a C major scale on the piano.
Okay.
At this stage, the specific sequence of finger movements is encoded temporarily right there within the striatum, which is the input center of the basal ganglia. Your prefrontal cortex comes up with the plan, hit the C key, and the basal ganglia roots that command to your finger.
But the basal ganglia doesn't want to hold on to that memory forever. Right?
No, it's a transient storage system. Over time, through hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice, step 2 kicks in. This relies on a fundamental mechanism of the brain called Hebbian plasticity.
I want to pause and explain Hebbian plasticity because it's a cornerstone of neuroscience. The famous phrase is neurons that fire together wire together.
A classic.
If cell A repeatedly and persistently takes part in firing cell B, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells so that cell A's efficiency in firing cell B is physically increased.
You are literally building a thicker, more conductive physical bridge between the neurons. But in skill acquisition, this Hebbian plasticity is heavily modulated by dopamine.
Dopamine, the reward chemical.
People think of dopamine as just pleasure, but in the context of the basal ganglia, dopamine acts as a biological save button.
A save button, that's a great way to put it.
When you hit the right key on the piano and you hear the correct note, you get a microburst of dopamine. That dopamine floods the synapses in the basal ganglia, signaling to the network, whatever routing sequence you just executed, that was correct. Reinforce that pathway.
And over time, as that dopamine-modulated reinforcement continues, something incredible structural happens. The stimulus-response association, like seeing the sheet music and pressing the key, gets hardwired directly into the cortical pathways.
Yes.
The outer layers of the brain form a direct physical connection with each other.
They build a highway that eventually bypasses the basal ganglia entirely.
We see this beautifully illustrated in animal models. The sources include a 2014 paper by Leisman titled Cognitive Motor Interactions of the Basal Ganglia in Development. They detail an experiment where researchers trained rodents to navigate a complex T-maze.
Right.
The rats had to listen to specific auditory cues, like a high-pitched tone or a low-pitched tone, to figure out which way to turn to get a food reward.
It's a classic procedural learning paradigm.
Early in the training, when the rats were essentially amateurs, the researchers were recording the electrical activity inside the striatal neurons, that input center of the basal ganglia we talked about. And they found that those neurons were firing continuously throughout the entire maze run.
Because they're figuring it out.
Exactly. The rat is constantly thinking, okay, I heard the tone, I'm walking forward, should I turn left? Am I doing this right? Where is the food?
The switchboard operator is frantically routing information at every single junction.
But once the rat completely mastered the maze, once the training was complete and the rat was an expert, the firing pattern in the basal ganglia completely changed.
It's so cool.
Those striatal neurons stopped firing during the run. They only fired at the very beginning of the maze to essentially load and initiate the murder plan, and they fired at the very end of the maze to evaluate the reward. During the actual running of the maze, making the turns, the basal ganglia was virtually silent.
The brain chunked the entire sequence into one single executable file.
It's like building a custom macro on a computer keyboard. At first, to format a document, you have to execute 10 different steps. You highlight the text, click the font menu, select bold, change the size to 14, change the color to blue.
Right, very step by step.
And that conscious execution is your prefrontal cortex and your basal ganglia working together. But eventually, you just program a macro.
Right.
You press Control-Shift-B, and the computer runs the entire 10-step sequence instantly and flawlessly.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize the cortical pathway.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the shift from the declarative neural network, which relies heavily on the caudate nucleus,
Right.
and the prefrontal cortex for rule-based, step-by-step conscious thought over to the procedural system.
Okay.
The basal ganglia is literally acting as the temporary scaffolding used to build that direct neural macro. And once the macro is built, the scaffolding is dismantled.
But the basal ganglia isn't acting alone here.
Right.
We also have to talk about the cerebellum. If the basal ganglia is the switchboard operator figuring out the routing, the cerebellum is the foreman on the factory floor making sure the product isn't defective.
The cerebellum, which sits right at the base of the skull, contains more than half of all the neurons in the human brain, despite only taking up about 10% of the brain's volume. It is incredibly dense.
We have a brand new 2026 systematic review and meta-analysis by Chen and colleagues titled Consistent Cortico-Basal Ganglia Cerebellar Activation in Early Motor Sequence Learning. They look specifically at the early acquisition phase of skill building, and they define the cerebellum as a supervised learning machine.
That phrasing is perfect.
Yeah.
The cerebellum operates on a mechanism of sensory prediction errors.
Let's explain that. If you swing a golf club, your brain has a mathematical prediction of exactly what that swing should feel like and exactly where the club head should hit the ball.
But when you are a novice, reality rarely matches the prediction. You slice the ball, your hands vibrate from a bad impact. The cerebellum receives that raw sensory feedback from your muscles and joints, and it compares it in real time against the original intended motor plan.
It measures the gap between intention and reality. That gap is the prediction error.
And it uses that error signal to physically adjust the weights of the neural connections for the next attempt. It optimizes the accuracy of your movements. Meanwhile, as the Chen meta-analysis points out, another region called the supplementary motor area, or the SMA, acts as a flexible hub.
The SMA, right?
Yeah, it takes these optimized micro-movements from the cerebellum and links them together into fluid, sequential phases of an action.
So to summarize this middle management phase, you have the prefrontal cortex declaring the goal. You have the basal ganglia testing the routing sequences and using dopamine to save the ones that work. You have the cerebellum fine-tuning the physical physics of the movement by calculating errors. And you have the SMA linking it all together into a smooth chain.
And they all work together in this exhausting, metabolically expensive symphony to ultimately train the outer cortex to do the job automatically.
Which brings us to a massive question in section 3 of our deep dive. If this middle management system has trained the cortex and then stepped away, what does the fully optimized expert cortical map actually look like?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because there is a persistent cultural myth, you hear it everywhere, that we only use 10% of our brains. And the natural assumption is that geniuses and experts must be using 100%. They must have massive glowing brains firing everywhere at once.
But the structural shifts we see in motor mastery tell a completely different, almost paradoxical story. Expertise is not about using more of your brain. It is about aggressively isolating and using far less of it.
Let's look at the 2003 paper by Lotze and colleagues. This is a classic foundational study in the field of neuroaesthetics and motor control, published in the journal Neuroimage. The title is The Musician's Brain Functional Imaging of Amateurs and Professionals During Performance in Imagery.
Music is an exceptional domain for this research because the temporal precision required to play an instrument is at the absolute limit of human neuromotor capability.
Lotze's team took 7 highly trained professional violinists and 7 amateur violinists. They put them inside an fMRI machine. Now, you can't exactly play a full-size violin inside the claustrophobic tube of an MRI magnet, so they had them perform complex musical sequences using modified finger tapping, and then they had them just purely imagine performing the sequence.
And the physical data they recorded was a beautiful paradox.
Let's start with the physical output. During the actual execution of the musical sequence, the researchers measured the electrical activity in the subject's muscles using EMG or electromyography. The professional violinists had significantly higher EMG amplitudes than the amateurs.
Meaning their muscle contractions were stronger, more decisive, and more physically forceful. They were generating more kinetic energy.
Exactly. But despite generating more physical force and playing with much greater precision, the fMRI scans showed their brain activation was far more circumscribed.
It was incredibly localized.
Hold on, that completely breaks my intuitive understanding of physics. If I'm generating more muscle force, my brain should be working harder to generate that signal, right?
And not if the wiring is hyper-efficient. The professional's brain activation was tightly limited strictly to the contralateral primary motor cortex, the ipsilateral anterior cerebellum, and the primary auditory cortex. That is an incredibly sparse, clean circuit.
I want to translate that anatomy for a second. The contralateral primary motor cortex means the motor strip on the opposite side of the brain from the hand being used. The ipsilateral cerebellum means the cerebellum on the same side as the hand.
Right.
And the primary auditory cortex is obviously processing the sound. It's just a pure, isolated loop of movement, physical feedback, and sound processing. Nothing else.
Exactly. Now compare that to the amateurs. The amateurs showed this widespread, messy, scattered activation across the supplementary motor area, the premotor cortex, and the basal ganglia.
The middle management was still scrambling.
Their brains were working overtime, bleeding energy in all these secondary planning networks, just to produce a weaker, less precise physical movement.
This study provides the foundational evidence for a concept I absolutely love, the neural efficiency hypothesis, or the NEH.
The NEH essentially argues that high intelligence and high expertise are not characterized by how hard the brain works, but rather by how efficiently it routes information.
We have a 2021 systematic review in the journal fNIRS titled Neural Efficiency in Athletes, a systematic review that digs deeply into this. The authors describe the expert brain as cool and focused. They reviewed dozens of fMRI studies looking at elite athletes, professional golfers, Olympic basketball players, gymnasts.
Incredible subject.
They had these athletes lie in a scanner and simply imagine performing their specific sport.
Motor imagery is a powerful tool because it activates the exact same neural pathways as physical execution, just without the final signal sent to the spinal cord.
When these elite athletes imagined their own sport, they showed drastically reduced BOLD activation. BOLD stands for blood oxygen level dependent signal. It's how fMRI measures brain activity. The athletes showed massive reductions in the putamen, the SMA, and the insula compared to when they were asked to imagine a sport they weren't experts in.
They are burning significantly fewer calories to run a far more complex physical simulation.
Because they have carved out a path of least resistance. But we need to make sure we don't just talk about functional efficiency, which is how the brain uses energy in the moment. The data shows there are literal, permanent structural changes to the brain's hardware.
Yes. Let's talk about the physical remodeling of the brain. The sources utilize a technique called Voxel-Based Morphometry, or VBM. This is a neuroimaging analysis technique that investigates focal differences in brain anatomy. It literally measures the physical volume of gray matter and white matter tissue.
It measures the thickness of the cortex. And if you look at VBM data for professional musicians, you see that they have physically increased gray matter in several specific regions.
Very specific regions.
The left precentral gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex, Heschel's gyrus, which is deeply involved in processing pitch and melody in the auditory cortex, and the superior parietal cortex, which integrates sensory information.
But the most incredible finding, the one that really made me stare at the wall for a minute, comes from string players specifically.
Oh, this is mind-blowing.
If you look at their primary somatosensory cortex, the part of the brain that maps the sense of touch across your body, specifically a subregion called Area 3B, the physical cortical representation for the fingers of their left hand, so digits 2 through 5, the fingers pressing the strings on the fretboard, is massively expanded.
The brain map for their left hand has physically grown.
It has annexed surrounding tissue. It has taken up more biological real estate. And the size of that physical expansion correlates directly with the age they began their musical training. If they started at age 4, the map is huge. If they started at 12, it's smaller.
The brain is a ruthless biological real estate market. The areas that are used most demand more metabolic resources, and they physically expand their territory, often at the expense of less utilized surrounding areas.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We are seeing two things happening simultaneously. The brain is physically expanding the hardware for the specific fingers needed for the task, but functionally, it is aggressively shutting down all the surrounding networks.
Right. It's pruning away extraneous neural noise.
Structurally, experts are carving out a highly exclusive VIP neural pathway that actively ignores everything else.
This is an essential adaptation for human survival and elite performance. By insulating that specialized sensoromotor parietal pathway, the expert brain becomes biologically immune to dual-task interference.
Going back to our surgeon counting backwards from 100.
Exactly. If a professional violinist is standing on stage playing a wildly complex Paganini concerto, you could flash bright lights in their eyes, you could shout their name from the front row, and their motor output won't degrade.
They wouldn't miss a beat.
The neural pathway running the concerto is heavily insulated from the parts of the brain processing visual or emotional distractions. But an amateur's messy, widespread activation relies on general-purpose networks. Those networks are highly vulnerable. They easily get hijacked by any sudden distraction.
That makes perfect logical sense for physical sports and playing instruments, because those domains rely so heavily on muscle memory and high-speed somatosensory feedback. But what if the expertise is purely intellectual?
A completely different ballgame.
What if you were sitting completely still in a chair with no time pressure, just thinking? Does a chess grandmaster's brain physically remodel itself the way a violinist's does?
The short answer is unequivocally yes. But the regions involved in that remodeling are profoundly different, which brings us to the cognitive side of expertise and what happens when abstract thinking itself becomes a biological reflex.
Section 4. Cognitive expertise. Let's dive into the minds of chess grandmasters. There is a fascinating 2021 paper published in fNIRS titled Morphometric and Functional Brain Connectivity Differentiates Chess Masters from Amateur Players. The researchers used a highly advanced novel machine learning approach called a Functional Morphometric Similarity Connectome, or FMSC.
It's a very robust, cutting-edge methodology. Traditionally, studies look at either structure or function. The FMSC combines structural MRI data, the physical shape and volume of the brain, with resting state functional connectivity data, how the different regions talk to each other rhythmically while the brain is just sitting idle.
So they are looking at both the hardware configuration and the baseline software operating system simultaneously.
Exactly.
And using this combined FMSC model, the researchers were able to train a computer to classify chess masters versus amateur players with an astounding 88% accuracy. That was a 14% improvement over using just standard functional connectivity methods alone. The biological differences are that stark.
But the specific structural changes they found are what make this study so important.
Right. Remember how the violinists had more gray matter in their finger mapping regions? Well, when they looked at the brains of these chess grandmasters, they found a significant decrease in gray matter volume in the bilateral caudate nucleus.
The caudate nucleus being a major input structure of the basal ganglia, our old friend from the middle management phase.
Exactly. They pruned it away. They physically lost brain tissue in that region. I need you to explain this because earlier we established that the basal ganglia is crucial for learning rules. How does literally shrinking that part of your brain make you a better chess player?
It's a perfect example of network optimization. The caudate nucleus is heavily involved in goal-directed action and learning those early step-by-step associations. If the knight moves in an L shape, then it can capture the pawn. When you're a novice, you need a massive, robust caudate to hold on to all those clunky declarative rules.
Because you are consciously calculating every single possibility.
But a grandmaster doesn't calculate moves like a computer. A grandmaster recognizes patterns instantly. By decreasing the volume of the caudate nucleus, the brain is aggressively streamlining the structure.
Pruning the dead weight.
It is pruning away millions of inefficient, slow synapses to make the remaining circuitry incredibly fast and precise. They don't need a bulky, general-purpose processor anymore. They need a highly tuned aerodynamic one that instantly triggers a gut instinct about a board position.
And speaking of pattern recognition, the data gets even stranger. There is a 2013 paper, also in fNIRS, titled Expertise and Processing Distorted Structure in Chess. This study investigates exactly how chess experts visually process the 64 squares on the board. Now, we all have a specific region in the visual cortex of our brain called the Fusiform face area, or the FFA.
Evolutionarily speaking, the FFA is one of our most specialized, hardwired visual modules. It is designed specifically to recognize human faces. It allows you to look at a crowd and instantly tell if someone is a friend, a foe, if they're happy, or if they're angry. It processes the holistic structure of the eyes, nose, and mouth all at once, rather than looking at each feature individually.
But this 2013 study found something staggering. Chess experts actually repurposed the fusiform face area. They used the facial recognition software of their brain to holistically recognize chessboard patterns.
It's amazing.
When a grandmaster looks at a complex mid-game position, they aren't looking at a knight on f3 and a bishop on c4. They are looking at the overall face of the board. They recognize the expression of the defense instantly.
And the researchers proved this by tricking the experts.
Yes. They randomized the pieces on the board so that they no longer made sense according to the rules of chess. It was a board position that could never naturally occur in a game. And when they showed this randomized board to the grandmasters, their brains panicked. The holistic facial recognition failed, and the grandmasters engaged a heavy prefrontal parietal network to actively hunt for structural logic.
They showed a massive spike in activation in the left inferior parietal sulcus, or IPS, which is involved in spatial attention and working memory.
And crucially, that spike in IPS activation simply wasn't there in the amateur novices when they looked at the exact same randomized board.
Because to the novices, it all just looks like a bunch of random pieces anyway. They didn't know enough to realize the face was distorted.
I have to stop and push back on this because I want to make sure you listening truly grasp the magnitude of this. Are you saying that a chess grandmaster is literally viewing a wooden chessboard the exact same way you and I view a human face?
Essentially, yes.
How is that biologically possible? How can the human brain just reassign a specialized module that evolution spent millions of years building strictly for human facial recognition and just hand the keys over to a board game that was invented 1,000 years ago?
It's a phenomenal question, and it speaks to the ultimate pragmatism of neuroplasticity. The brain is not sentimental about its evolutionary history. It doesn't care what a cortical region was originally designed for. It optimizes purely for whatever environmental demand is placed on it repeatedly.
It's basically cortical hijacking.
That's a great term for it. The FFA is exceptionally good at one specific mathematical computation: processing complex, holistic spatial relationships instantly. A chess grandmaster spends tens of thousands of hours staring at complex spatial relationships on an 8x8 grid.
Right.
The brain realizes, hey, this facial recognition hardware is perfectly suited for this chess problem. So it simply allocates its best pattern recognition processor to the task that demands it most.
That is deeply profound. And we see similar structural rewiring in other intense cognitive domains. Look at simultaneous interpreters. These are the people sitting in soundproof booths at the United Nations, listening to a speech in Russian and speaking the translation out loud in English at the exact same time, with only a 2-second delay.
It is arguably one of the most cognitively demanding tasks a human being can perform. The interference between the two languages should theoretically cause a complete breakdown of the prefrontal cortex.
But it doesn't. According to a neuroplasticity review in our sources, these expert interpreters show a distinct functional dissociation right inside the striatum.
The striatum, again, being the input station of the basal ganglia.
Right. In these interpreters, the basal ganglia splits its duties. The caudate nucleus takes over the overarching language selection, acting as a gatekeeper to make sure they are pulling vocabulary from the English network and entirely suppressing the French or Russian networks.
And the putamen handles the rest.
Exactly. The putamen handles the immediate, high-speed motor overlap of hearing a word through the headphones and articulating a different word with the mouth simultaneously.
They structurally compartmentalize the cognitive load.
And over time, just like the violinist's fingers, these interpreters physically grow thicker cortex in their temporal lobes and specialized phonetic processing regions. They literally build more biological hardware to handle the specific bottleneck of their profession.
If we synthesize all of this, whether you are a violinist expanding your somatosensory map, a surgeon quieting your prefrontal cortex, a chess player shrinking your caudate, or an interpreter compartmentalizing your basal ganglia, this structural rewiring doesn't just change how fast or how well you perform.
It changes the experience itself.
Yes, it leads to a completely different psychological reality. When the architecture of the brain changes this dramatically, the conscious experience of existing while performing the task changes.
Which brings us to the ultimate psychological state of expertise, Section 5. Peak performance, large-scale networks, and the neuroscience of flow. We are zooming out. We've spent this entire time looking at localized brain regions, a gyrus here, a nucleus there. Now we need to look at the macro level, how the whole symphony plays together across the entire brain.
To understand flow states and peak performance, we have to define the 3 core large-scale networks that govern human consciousness. These are the Central Executive Network, the CEN, the Default Mode Network, the DMN, and the Salience Network, the SN.
Let me break these down. Think of the Central Executive Network as your external focus. When you are solving a complex math problem or navigating heavy traffic or actively analyzing a chessboard, your CEN is highly active. The Default Mode Network, the DMN, is the exact opposite. It's your internal focus. When you are staring out a window daydreaming, or worrying about an argument you had yesterday, or wondering what someone thinks of your outfit, your DMN is running the show. It is the neurological network of the self.
And the Salience Network acts as the biological toggle switch between the two. It constantly monitors your environment and your internal state, decides what is most important or salient in that exact millisecond, and switches the brain's resources between the external CEN and the internal DMN.
So, keeping those 3 networks in mind, let's go back to our board game experts. There is a study published in PLOS1 titled Large-Scale Brain Networks in Board Game Experts. The researchers put grandmasters in a scanner and watched these 3 macro networks interact. They found that when chess experts are playing, they exhibit a much broader, much faster, and far more robust task-induced deactivation of the default mode network compared to novices.
They violently shut down the self-referential part of their brain.
Yes. They completely reallocate all metabolic resources to the central executive network. The novice, while playing, is still partly engaged in the DMN. The novice is thinking, man, my opponent looks really confident. Am I taking too long to move? I hope I don't look stupid.
But the expert brain actively suppresses the neural circuitry responsible for ego and self-consciousness. There is no self left to worry. There is only the board.
And this active, massive suppression of the DMN is the neurological signature of flow. There is a fascinating paper in fNIRS exploring flow states and creativity. The authors describe the flow state as a period of transient hypofrontality.
That's a great term. Let's break it down.
Transient means temporary. Hypo means low or underactive. And frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex.
Specifically, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a major node of the default mode network.
During a flow state, the medial prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline. And because this is the region that generates your sense of self-consciousness and also your perception of time passing, shutting it down explains exactly why flow feels the way it does. People in the zone report losing hours of time without realizing it, and they say the action felt effortless, completely devoid of self-doubt or hesitation.
While that inner critic is silenced, the executive network and the subcortical reward networks, specifically the nucleus accumbens, massively upregulate. The brain is flooding the system with dopamine, providing an intense feeling of intrinsic reward while simultaneously running the highly optimized cortical macros we discussed earlier.
This fluid switching of networks brings up a term introduced in the sources that I'm absolutely obsessed with. It's a relatively new concept in neuroscience called the crenectome. Not the connectome, which is the static map of brain wiring, but the crenectome, which refers to the brain's time-varying functional connectivity.
It looks at the brain not as a static photograph, but as a movie. It measures how fluidly the brain transitions between different network states over time.
The researchers found that chess experts have a highly fluid, dynamic connectome. They transition through distinct metastates much more rapidly and smoothly than amateurs. If a novice makes a mistake, they get stuck in a state of frustration.
They dwell on it.
Yeah, their DMN lights up with self-criticism, and they can't toggle back to the executive network quickly. But an expert's brain glides seamlessly between evaluation, execution, and error correction, millisecond by millisecond.
True expertise isn't just possessing a statically altered brain structure. It's possessing a dynamic, highly flexible operating system that never gets stuck.
So if you are sitting at home right now or driving your car and you're thinking, how do I apply this to my life? How do I get into flow at work or while playing the guitar? The data tells us a hard truth. Getting in the zone isn't magic. It isn't a mystical aura you can just summon by drinking coffee and listening to lo-fi beats.
Nope, not at all.
It is a mathematically precise neurobiological state, the downregulation of the ego and the upregulation of the automated procedural networks.
And this raises a crucial, often misunderstood point about skill acquisition. Novices physically cannot reliably enter a flow state.
Right, never.
They might experience moments of intense focus or hyperfixation, but true, sustained flow is physiologically impossible when your prefrontal cortex is still busy micromanaging the mechanics of the task. If you are constantly monitoring your fingers on the guitar fretboard, your PFC is active, which means you cannot achieve transient hypofrontality.
You can't shut off the CEO if the CEO is the only one who knows how to run the machine.
Precisely. Flow is not a biohack you can use to learn faster. Flow is the ultimate biological reward you receive after you have endured the grueling, repetitive, PFC-heavy structural rewiring of your brain.
You have to build the macro before you can press the button. You have to build the procedural architecture in the basal ganglia, let the cerebellum optimize it through thousands of prediction errors, and physically hardwire it into the cortex. Only then can the prefrontal CEO take a vacation and let the flow state emerge.
There are no shortcuts in neuroplasticity.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and summarize this incredible journey we've just been on. We started by looking at the exhausting, prefrontal cortex-heavy amateur brain, where the CEO is frantically micromanaging every single suture and every single musical note, burning immense amounts of metabolic energy just to perform adequately.
We saw how the brain hands control over to the basal ganglia, acting as a switchboard to temporarily route information and test pathways.
We saw how the cerebellum acts as a relentless, supervised learning machine, calculating sensory prediction errors to refine our physical movements in real time. And we saw how dopamine acts as the save button, building direct cortical bridges that eventually bypass the middle management entirely.
And we saw the physiological, structural results of that decades-long process. The hyper-efficient, highly insulated brain of the true expert. A brain that expands its somatosensory maps, shrinks its general-purpose processors, and literally repurposes facial recognition software to read a chessboard.
A brain that burns less energy to do infinitely more complex work. It is a beautiful system. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought that we haven't explicitly discussed yet, but it is lingering heavily in the background of these recent neuroimaging papers.
It's the inevitable, slightly controversial next frontier in this field of research.
Right. If we now know exactly how the mechanics of expertise work, if we know it relies on cerebellar error correction and the specific routing of subcortical networks to build automaticity, what are the practical implications of using targeted neurostimulation to artificially force it?
Several of the sources briefly touch upon the use of cerebellar transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS.
Right. Researchers are already running experiments where they place electrodes on a subject's scalp and pass a mild, targeted electrical current directly through the cerebellum while the subject learns a new physical skill.
And the preliminary data suggests that anodal TDCS can significantly enhance online motor skill acquisition. By artificially altering the electrical gradient of the neurons in the cerebellum, you increase their excitability.
It's wild.
You are essentially hypercharging the brain's ability to calculate prediction errors and learn from its mistakes in real time.
So the massive question this leaves us with is this. Could we one day put on a headset, stimulate our cerebellum, and bypass the clumsy, exhausting, prefrontal heavy amateur phase of learning entirely? Will the famous 10,000-hour rule of mastery become the 1,000-hour rule or the 100-hour rule just by externally modifying the electrical environment of our brain?
It forces us to ask a philosophical question about what expertise actually is. Is expertise defined by the grueling psychological journey and the discipline required to build the neural architecture organically? Or is expertise just the possession of the architecture itself, regardless of how quickly or artificially it was constructed?
That is a wild thought to end on. If the MRI scan shows the brain has rewired itself into a state of mastery, does it matter if it took 10 years of blood and sweat or 10 weeks with a battery pack? To you listening, wherever you are, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the literal mechanics of the expert brain. Whatever skill you are trying to master right now, just remember, every clumsy mistake is just a prediction error helping your cerebellum build a better macro. Keep practicing, keep rewiring, and until next time.